Boop, 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 boop. Boop, 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 boop.
All right. I think you did research to ask questions or something.
Yes.
Anyways, are you ready, Sam?
Let's do
We can
it.
keep bullshitting if you want.
I mean,
Or we can bullshit while recording. It's the
we
same
should-
thing.
Yeah, I mean,
We bullshit all the
we
time
might as well
while
have
we're
the tape rolling, you know?
Okay,
Always have
mine
the
as
tape
well.
rolling.
Yeah.
So we have Sam, the chiropractor. I think that's what you said.
Well, not quite. I'm a chiropterologist.
A chiropterologist. So what is
Yes.
a chiropterologist?
I study the coolest organisms ever, and that is bats.
Arguably.
Yes, arguably.
Well,
yes.
over the next however long you wish to talk about this, I guess we'll decide whether it is the coolest or...
Oh, I could talk all evening about bats.
I mean, you are very close to becoming a Dr. Freeze,
Yes.
right?
Yes, that is true. It depends on the day. Some days I'm a Batman, you know, when I'm feeling good, and then other days I'm Mr. Freeze or Dr. Freeze, the supervillain. Just depends on the day.
Cool, alright.
Yeah.
So can you give us some background on your studying? How did you get into it? What got you started into bats?
Yeah. So I've always been interested in the creepy crawlies. As a little kid, I was always playing in the backyard, in the creek, flipping over logs, catching snakes, all that good stuff. And then I would say I first got interested in bats when I was working as a wee middle schooler at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And one of the biologists there that sort of took me under her wing and taught me a lot of what I know, her name is Lisa Gatens. She's a bat biologist. And so the first time she took, little wee Sam out way past after his bedtime and caught these little flying gremlins of the night out in the forest, I was hooked. I thought it was so cool. And pretty much from then on, I knew I wanted to potentially work with bats. They're super cool, and I went and got a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology at NC State, and then was lucky enough to get this project working with bats here at Virginia Tech.
Wow, that's really cool. So
Yeah.
I mean, the day that you got to stay up past your bedtime, you're like, yes, if I can stay past my bedtime for this,
If
yes.
I can get paid to stay up after my bedtime every night and catch these awesome little creatures, that's a pretty good life. So, yep, and I'm making it work.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds great. You were
Yeah.
telling me just recently you were out in the field catching other bats, and you love sending me pictures of these really cool bats.
I do, yeah. I love sending people pictures of bats because people don't realize that they're actually like really adorable, and they come in all kinds of different colors,
so cute.
shapes, and sizes. I think they're just the cutest little things ever.
So speaking of adorable, I have a serious conservation question.
Okay.
We call them
yes.
bats, right?
Yes.
But before,
Yeah, when I was doing some research, I did not know this, but apparently they used to be called flitter mice.
Oh yeah. So the
way more adorable.
Way cuter.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's interesting. In a lot of other languages, when you so in that case, I think that's German, Fledermaus. It literally means flying mouse, which I think, and in some other languages too, when you literally translate it to English, it means flying mouse, which I think is interesting because that's actually a huge misnomer. They are not mice. They are not even closely related to mice. In fact, they're more closely related to the primates than they are to mice. So they're. I think they're probably closest. So the group Chiroptera, which are all of our bats, I think they can be traced back to probably their closest living relative right now is the colugo, which is a flying lemur of Southeast Asia. And it's, again, a misnomer. It's actually not a lemur. It's just an arboreal mammal that's a glider. And that colugo is a very close relative of the living primates. So it's, in a sense, bats are actually more closely related to us than they are to mice.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's really interesting, actually.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Little known fact about bats.
So, where do gremlins fall in evolutionary biology as far as primates and the fluttermouse?
Yeah, well, bats have been around for a long time. They can be traced roughly back to the Eocene epoch, I believe,
Okay.
which was, I think, roughly about 50, 60 million years ago. And it's kind of interesting, too. Evolutionary ecologists have been going back and forth about, did bats develop flight first or echolocation first, or did they both develop at the same time? And actually just recently, I think it was about 2003, they discovered a fossil of a bat that, as far as they can tell, was able to fly. And this fossil was about 53.5 million years old, I believe. And they could tell that it could fly, but it didn't have the correct structures in its ear in order to echolocate, essentially. So, yeah, that kind of answered that question. I mean, it still needs to be researched more, but yeah. So yeah, bats have been around for a long time, and they're still to this day the only mammal that has ever evolved powered flight. There's other mammals that have membranes that allow them to glide, but bats are the only ones that have powered flight.
I had a question though, right? You said powered flight. Now,
Yes.
just for our listeners, can you define powered flight for us?
Yeah. So essentially, in a nutshell, they flap their wings and produce lift. And are
Flippy
able-
flap.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're flippy
All right.
flappers.
The flippy
Yeah,
flappers.
That's right.
All right.
That's right.
I mean, are they silent when they fly, or can you hear the flap,
You
flap?
can actually hear them.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty quiet, but I've had bats zoom right past my face, and I can hear them. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Interesting. Are there animals that have silent flight?
Yeah, I would say your owls.
The owls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
or
That sounds about right.
they've
Wings of
developed-
death.
That's right.
Okay.
Wings of
Or
death.
the bats' wings of death.
Well, yeah, bats are. That brings up another interesting point too. The saying "batshit crazy," right? Since we're talking about birds versus bats here, this reminded me of that. Yeah, that saying just doesn't make any sense to me, because that came from people watching bats, and it looks like they're flying very erratically. They're batshit crazy, when in fact they're extremely agile flyers. They're able to morph the shape of their wing in flight, which helps with maneuverability. And if you think about it, evolutionarily speaking, they have to catch little insects flying around rapidly in a dense forest at night. So they need to be very good at flying. So I think that saying is dumb.
Batshit
It's
crazy.
not true.
Well, thank you for clearing that up, because I always thought that batshit crazy was when someone was around too much guano, getting a little loopy up on the head.
Well, yes, yes.
So earlier too, you mentioned both the flight and the echolocation. So can you explain to us how bats actually use echolocation to find their prey?
Yeah. So not all bats echolocate, but I would say a vast majority of them do. And they use it for two purposes. One is navigation at night, so essentially they don't run into a tree and die. The other reason is to catch prey. They most likely, we think they were in competition, the very early bats, they were in competition with birds. And so they had to start going out and hunting at night to avoid competition and predation by birds. And if you're out at night, you need to develop some way to navigate and to catch prey without running into something. And so they eventually evolved to be able to echolocate, which is the same thing as sonar. So it's ultrasound, everything above about 20 kilohertz. And for reference, young people can usually hear up to about 18, 19 kilohertz. And then as you age, your hearing starts to get worse and you can't hear up to that high frequencies. You know those apps that people use in like elementary school where they play a tone that the teacher can't hear but everybody else in the class can? That's exactly that. It's playing a frequency that adults can't hear, but kids can hear because their hearing hasn't gone quite as much. So humans can hear right up to about the threshold between audible sound and ultrasound, and most bats start echolocating at about 18 kilohertz. So yeah, there are some bats where you can actually kind of hear, if you're a little younger, you can kind of hear the bottom end of the echolocation. But yeah, they use it to navigate at night and catch bugs. So
Wow.
Yep.
So if we listen real closely, we can hear beautiful songs of death as these machines fly through and eat all of the insects.
for some species, yes, potentially.
Yeah, because some species are insectivores, but also you have the frugivores and then the
Oh,
vampire
yeah,
bats too.
yeah.
So why is that that distinction between their diets?
Yeah, so bats are an incredibly diverse group. In fact, they make up about a quarter of all mammals on the planet, and they pretty much eat anything. I mean, there's bats that will eat blood, there's bats that will eat birds, there's bats that will eat other bats, mice, fruit, the frugivores. A vast majority of them are insectivores, they eat insects. There's even some species that will fish. They'll literally catch fish just under the surface of water.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, they eat tons of different stuff. And not all of those bats need to echolocate to do their thing. There are some frugivore bats that do echolocate, but a lot of the fruit-eating bats just use eyesight. So yeah.
Are those fruit-eating bats also nocturnal? Or
Yep,
are they
yeah.
diurnal?
Yeah, most bats are nocturnal. There's a few exceptions. In the tropics, there are some bats that will come out during the day, but they'll stay in the very shaded parts of the jungle, essentially to avoid predation. But yeah, but the vast majority of bats are nocturnal.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
So those frugivore bats too, they also serve as pollinators, correct?
Oh yeah, for sure. Bats are a very, very important pollinator. And in fact, if you like your tequila, you should like bats.
Oh, I like my tequila, that's for sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
tequila is great. Yeah, bats are, I think, the sole pollinator actually of the agave plant.
Really?
Yeah, and so essentially, if you like tequila, you should love your bats.
I knew there was a reason bats are in my top 5 favorite animals.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Man, that's really interesting. A fourth of all mammals. That's
Yeah.
intense. That's widely diverse.
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely, yeah. There's about 1,200 different species of bats worldwide, roughly speaking.
Okay. So
lots of them.
often when I consider bats, especially for conservation, I get concerns over things like white nose, where you have these communal collections of bats, right? So I would like to talk about conservation in a minute, but are all bats communal?
No, bats run the whole gamut of life histories and levels of sociality. Some bats are totally solitary. Some bats form colonies that number in the millions. So they pretty much run the gamut. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Good. So about white nose and other things.
Yes.
As far as conservation goes.
Yes. Well, yeah. White nose is bad. So white nose syndrome.
Well, real quick, just so that people know, what is white nose syndrome?
Yeah, white nose syndrome is a fungus. It's Pseudogymnoascus destructans is the scientific name. It's a mouthful. And it's a fungus that it was introduced to the United States. As best we know, ground zero is up in Albany, New York, or at least near there. And it was introduced around 2005, 2006. And essentially what it does is it loves the cool, damp environment of the cave. And so it grows on the bats while they're hibernating. And we're talking about bats that cluster together in the caves and can number in the millions. And so it infects them, and it basically wakes them up from hibernation and irritates them, and they use up their fat reserves, and they die before they emerge in the wintertime. It also disrupts their electrolyte imbalances and some other bad stuff. So since then, it has spread like a massive raging wildfire all throughout the eastern U.S., and it's spreading west. And it goes up into Canada as well. And it's killed millions and millions of bats. In fact, some of the species of bats that used to be the most common bats here in North America, we've seen, upwards of 95% declines in their population. So, yeah, I mean, literally, bats that used to be everywhere are just wiped off the face of the planet, practically. So it's a huge deal. And bats, they're out there every night eating roughly their body weight in insects. And those are insects that are damaging our agricultural crops, spreading disease, all that kind of stuff. And in fact, I can't remember exactly, but I think I read a number one time that something like upwards of like $18 billion are attributed to bats. $18 billion of agriculture are attributed to bats every year.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's not good that they're disappearing rapidly. So yeah, and that brings me to some of my research. There are researchers that are focusing more on the disease aspect of it. And then there's researchers like me that are focusing more on the land management aspect of bats being gone from the landscape.
So land management.
Yes.
Now, I don't know a lot about bats.
Yes.
I've never seen a bat crawling for most of its life. So why is it land management rather than air management?
No, that's an excellent question. Yeah. So bats, they roost in trees for the most part. Here in the eastern U.S., there's two main groups of bats. There's your migratory tree bats that are up in trees year-round, and instead of going back to caves to hibernate, they just migrate south to more trees.
I mean, that sounds like old people in Florida.
That's right. Yeah. Basically, they're just the snowbirds. Yeah. But then the other group of bats are your cave bats, and they actually go out. They emerge in the springtime, and they migrate to trees, and they have their babies up in the trees. And then in the fall, they migrate back to a cave, and they hibernate all winter long in the cave. So white nose syndrome is really only affecting that group of bats. We can talk about what's impacting the tree bats later.
Okay.
Yeah. All bats are in trouble, unfortunately. So they're in the trees, right? They're foraging on insects that require plants, right? It's all habitat. And so we need to know what kind of habitat are these bats using, and how do we protect that habitat? And that's where my research focuses. And I'm trying to understand essentially how military training, things like fire, right? Like the military is launching mortars into the woods that's catching the woods on fire, and that alters habitat, right?
Yeah.
They're also, running tanks through there. They're cutting down trees for various purposes.
It's almost like the naturally placed tank doesn't quite belong in these ecosystems.
Yeah.
It's crazy how that works.
Yeah.
Look, the little wild running tank.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm in a nutshell understanding how different disturbances on the landscape, like fire, like forestry, cutting trees, that kind of stuff, impacts these bats that have been hit heavily by white nose syndrome. And that's important so that land managers can take that information and make sure that military training or that forestry practices, agricultural practices are compatible with the conservation of these imperiled bats. And so I do my research at Marine Corps Base Quantico in a national park attached to the North Prince William Forest Park. And I've been doing it for about 3 years now, and it's been a lot of fun. So
Wow,
yeah.
I mean, that sounds great. That sounds fun.
Yeah, for sure.
So these tree bats, right?
Yep,
So you
yep.
also have owls that live in trees and other places, right?
Yes.
So I know this isn't your expertise, but I've always wondered, where did the barn owls live before we built barns?
Well, I would think they probably lived up in the trees. Yes.
So,
And they probably still do. Yes.
so besides those, if we talk about conservation, I'm interested in that. So, what conservation effects are in place now to help bats? Because we see a lot of this decline in population.
Yeah.
Are there things that we need to look at? If there are things that people need to be concerned about that they should be, I guess, trying to help or promote for bat conservation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, a lot of these species that have been hit heavily by white nose syndrome, in particular the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and Indiana bats, and tricolor bats as well. A lot of them have been hit hard. They're starting to get listed on the Endangered Species Act, which affords them federal protection, meaning you can't directly kill those bats, and you also can't harm their critical habitat. And so if, you know, a federal landowner like the military, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, or even on private land, but if there's federal dollars being used for anything going on private land, it means that they have to essentially consider the bats and how any of their actions are going to potentially help or harm bats. And so that's helped a lot. But in order to be able to actually understand that, that's where research like what I'm doing comes into it, because we need to actually understand how, if you cut a bat roost tree down, how does that impact them? Or if you burn the forest, which is a good thing generally, how does that impact them? So that's one way that through legislation bats are being protected, but also at home, a good way to help them is to put up bat houses. So, if we're cutting trees down, we're altering habitat that's critical for these bats to survive. So it's very helpful to put up a bat house to provide them some habitat. If you cut a bunch of trees down, put up a bat house. So yeah, another thing you can do also is if you have bats in your house, be sure that you work with a licensed wildlife removal specialist who knows how to actually safely remove those bats so that you don't kill them. Because if you do it the wrong way, you could kill them, which first of all is illegal, but second of all, it's not the ecologically responsible thing to do. So, yes.
So you deal a lot with conservation, obviously, of bats, and they're important to our ecosystem.
Yeah.
We already mentioned pollination. How else are they important to our ecosystem?
Well, yeah, pollination, and then they control tons of insect pests. So, yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, essentially, I like to paint the picture of bats as like organic bug spray, sort of. I saw a cool meme one time on Instagram about that. Yeah, it's the organic way to control pests that are eating our crops.
So if we could get like bats in a can,
I think that would be sweet. Yeah.
just go out to the backyard, spray it with bats.
Yeah, I think farmers need lots of bat houses around their fields to help. Yeah, and it is interesting too. It's very early on. We don't have much research that actually demonstrates this, but we think that the increasing use of pesticides worldwide is actually leading to a slow but steady decline in bats worldwide. Again, not much hard science showing that or demonstrating those trends, but a lot of bat biologists or chiropterologists, as I like to say, are kind of noticing that. And if you think about it, that's kind of a huge extinction vortex mess, right? The pesticides are killing off bats. Other things are killing off bats, like habitat loss, habitat degradation, disease like the white nose syndrome. And so you need to use more pesticides, and then that just leads to more bats dead. So it's a huge mess. Yeah. But bat houses, excluding bats from your house responsibly, and just not being as scared of them. they're nothing to be afraid of. If you just leave them alone, they'll leave you alone.
Yeah, I mean, they seem like such friendly, wonderful creatures.
Absolutely.
Fluttering about their day,
Yep.
like a beautiful flying mouse.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, they're like any wildlife. If you just give them their space, then they'll go about their business eating all those insects that lets you, go to the grocery store and get
Yeah.
food for cheap. So,
So where do you
Yeah.
think the fear of bats came from? Is it because of their link to a lot of people say to rabies?
Yeah.
spreading rabies?
yeah, I think back in ancient times, it was just a, very cryptic, poorly understood, kind of creepy animal that, comes out at night. I mean, in certain parts of the world, some of the bats are huge and can be quite intimidating when they fly over your head. There's bats called flying foxes that have like a 6-foot wingspan, and it's basically like a chihuahua flying around, But I think more recently, yeah, they're, bats do harbor and spread a number of pretty nasty diseases. Yeah, and then one of those, probably the largest one people are worried about here in North America is rabies. And yes, bats do spread rabies, but the incidence of rabies in bats is actually pretty low. If you just don't touch bats, you're good. I always tell people, if you see a bat flying around at night is most likely perfectly normal. It's exhibiting normal behavior. If you see a bat flopping around on the sidewalk during the day, don't touch it. There's a good chance that it's sick, potentially from rabies. So yeah, and then that's how people get exposed. They almost never get exposed by just having bats in their attic or something like that. It's usually always like, they just find one on the sidewalk flopping around and their dog brings it to them or something like that. So yes.
but I mean, you have rabies shots and whatnot. But
Yes.
if I recall, you told me that you don't have to worry about that because you're already exposed to it. You're like anti-rabies blood.
Yeah,
So could
yeah.
we harvest your blood for that, or how does that work?
So since I work with bats, it's a given that I'm going to be bitten by bats. It happens. I'm out every night setting up big nets, and I catch them in the big nets and handle them. So I do get bitten, but the rabies vaccine is actually really good, and so I have my vaccine, and it protects me just fine. And I get my blood drawn every 2 years, and they essentially, as I understand it, introduce the rabies virus to it and test my immunity. And then if I need a booster shot, then I get one. So yeah, I don't worry about it too much. Again, I'm catching bats that are exhibiting normal behavior at night. So, yep. But yeah, as if you want to talk about catching bats, that's like my favorite thing to do ever. I can't believe I get paid to just go out all night and catch bats. Yeah, so bats generally fly along linear features in the woods. We're talking like a road or a trail running through the woods or a little stream. And so I go out and I set up these big tall poles. Some of my poles are like 30 feet high. And I stretch this very, very fine mesh net between the two poles. And essentially the bats just fly along that linear feature, la-da-da-da-da, not paying much attention, and they run right into the net and get caught. And then I can get them out, and then I can take measurements. I can identify what type of bat it is it a male or female, that kind of stuff. I can look for signs of white nose syndrome. And then what I actually do is I take a little pair of scissors and I give them a little haircut. I just trim a little bit of fur off their back, and I glue a little miniature tracking unit to their back. And that allows me to track them all around the forest and figure out, what kind of habitat do they need for roosting, what kind of trees are they up in, that kind of stuff. Where are they out foraging at night, all that cool information. And that's the critical information, because we need to know what kind of trees are they in, what condition are the trees in. One of my target species, the northern long-eared bat, which is a species that's been hit hard by white nose syndrome, they prefer snags. So dead trees, a snag is a dead tree. They like these snags with loose bark or little cavities in them, and they'll tuck up under there and have their babies up under the loose bark or in the hollowed out tree. So it's important to promote land management practices that leave snags on the landscape. That's all important stuff to understand. So, yep. But I love catching bats. And neat fact, when I'm handling the bats, we do want to wear protective gloves. And I found that batting gloves are perfect. Yep. Just a different type of batting. Yep. They're perfect. They're thin enough to have dexterity because these bats are pretty small. Most North American bats are pretty darn small. We're talking like, about the size of like your thumb. So, yeah, need thin gloves, but I still want a little bit of protection. So
Right.
batting gloves,
Right.
perfect.
I mean, that's what they were originally made for, right?
I mean, I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about maybe biological features of bats. So,
Yeah.
one thing that I found kind of interesting when I was looking a little bit more into them was that they found that they also had magnetoreception, similar to birds. Can you elaborate on that?
I'm actually not sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. You stumped me on that one.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
that's a first. All right. Well,
Yeah, I'll
alright.
have to read into that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So also it's nearing Halloween and everything.
Oh,
and
yeah, of
bats
course.
are of course associated with that. So can you tell us a little bit more about their roles in culture, especially since they're seen as these spooky things, even though they're so cute?
Yeah. They've just always been associated with being creepy. Yeah. Again, I think that's just they come out at night. They're just poorly understood. In modern days, we know that they do spread diseases. But yeah, I actually think it's interesting. I read an article that people are actually buying tropical bats online and using them as Halloween decorations. Yeah, and I think some of these can be like actually rare species sometimes that are just being harvested and shipped over to the United States to be used as decorations. So yeah, that's don't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, I'm pretty sure that's illegal to import rare species like that. But also that's just not
use them as a
responsible.
decoration as well.
Yeah. Just stick with like the stuffed bats or the paper bats and just put them on the wall.
I mean, like, if you want an authentic decoration for Halloween, just go to your nearest graveyard.
Well, yeah, that's,
It's a
it's
body. I mean, nobody's using it.
That seems more.
it's funny you mention that. Yeah. I do actually do quite a bit of bat netting in cemeteries. Because where else do you find bats?
Because where else would
right?
you find bats?
Yeah,
Because that's where they go, right?
yeah.
To commune with the spirits.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. You got to go to a spooky place to catch spooky critters. Yeah.
So, are bats your spirit animal?
I don't know about that. Yeah, my wife sometimes says that a bear is more my spirit animal. I don't know, because I tend to be a grumpy bear in the morning. I am definitely a nocturnal creature. Yeah. Yeah. From that respect, I think bats maybe are a spirit animal because I just love being up at night. But I'm not quite as feisty as bats. My personality's not super spicy. Yeah, bats, man, they have an attitude. Yeah, when you catch them, they are just screaming their heads off. They're squirming. They're biting.
Some guy just caught me.
yeah,
Massive,
Yeah.
giant,
I
just crushing
probably
me
would
between his
too.
palms.
Yes. Yeah, and it's interesting too. I mean, every different bat species has a totally different attitude or personality. Some bats are like just super chill.
The Rasta bat.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I would say like probably eastern red bats, which are just a beautiful kind of like burnt orange color. And they're one of the most common bats around here, here in the eastern U.S. They're generally pretty chill. You get them out of the net, and they don't tend to bite the heck out of you. They're just sweet little bats. But then the big brown bats. I know, super creative name. A lot of these bats
Wait,
are.
is that the real name?
That is
Wait,
their
big brown
common
bat?
name.
Big brown
Yep.
bat?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, big brown bat, and there is the little brown bat as well. Yeah.
Is there a medium brown
And then
bat?
no, there's no
What?
medium brown bat.
Wow.
Yeah, surprisingly. Yeah, and then the bats that are kind of a burnt orange color, reddish color, we just call the red bat. Yeah, I don't think bat biologists, at least here in North America, were super creative with their names. But yeah, the big brown bat, scientific name is Eptesicus fuscus. Man, it is a feisty bat. It's one of our larger bats here in eastern North America, and they also mainly eat beetles. And so they have to have jaw muscles and teeth that are strong enough to crush the exoskeleton of beetles. And that also means that they can really bite the heck out of your fingers. So that combined with their just somewhat mean demeanor, they're a handful when you try to get them out of the net. So yeah, I think it's interesting. They just all have different personalities. It's fun. Yeah.
So with all these different personalities, right? So similar to people have different personalities. People have different ways of, say, attracting friends or mates. So can you tell us about mating in the bat community?
Yeah. So I can only really speak mating wise for our eastern North American bats. But
Is that okay?
yeah, because I mean, it's just such a diverse group that there's so many different other mating strategies, in the tropics.
All right, what can we learn from their mating strategies?
Well, yeah, there is one tropical species in particular I will talk about that I think is really cool. But cool coming from a biologist, so probably not for your average person. But our bats here in North America, generally they mate in the fall, and that's called the fall swarm. The cave bats, they come back to the caves and they fly around the entrance, and some of them may mate in flight, but actually most of them mate in the caves. They'll roost on the cave walls and they'll crawl around and just mate with each other. And that's sort of the first phase, is actually awake mating, and then later on in the wintertime, some of the bats will the males will wake up out of hibernation and just walk around mating indiscriminately with other bats in the colony. Doesn't matter male or female.
So the sneaky mater.
Yes, yeah, that's the phase 2 or the sneaky phase
The
of
sneaky
mating.
phase, okay.
Yeah.
Real
And then
quick, you said mate in flight? Like they're literally flying together and they're mating. They're like, all right, we're both going to the
some of
same
them mate.
cave,
Yeah,
let's
some of them
just
mate
run our
in
way."
flight. Yeah, and I think that's actually more of a tree bat thing. The tree bats tend to mate in flight. Cave bats tend to mate on the walls of the cave. But yeah,
It
and
saves
it's
time.
it's actually really interesting. So I don't know if this podcast is like supposed to be PG rated or not.
No.
Go
but
for it.
yeah, so
Fuck.
Again, how are we going to get to
Great.
the younger audience, Brittany?
yeah, some bat penises are scary looking, man. Yeah, they've got essentially spiky hairs on the end that help them stay locked together in flight. And yeah, I've seen some macro photography pictures of bat penises, and some of them are a little unpleasant looking. Yeah, it's random bat fact. I guess a tropical species is there are a certain group of bats that I believe they're called the sack-winged bats, and they essentially, like, as far as I know, they stuff like feces and stuff in these little sac structures on their wings, and they let it rot to make a perfume. And they essentially fly up to a female, and they waft this, like poop, urine, and semen mixture in their sac wing. They waft their lovely perfume towards the females. So yeah, it's sexy.
Yeah.
I know.
Wow.
There's a lot of romance in bat mating. It seems like.
Absolutely, yeah.
So beautiful. It's almost like a candlelit dinner,
Yeah.
Let's go eat some insects, honey, and smell my feces.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. If only it was that easy in humans. Oh well. Just not shower at all,
Right.
whatnot. Yeah.
Exactly.
So.
So if you're looking to get a date, maybe try the bat's approach.
Maybe.
Just stuff some in your,
Yeah.
pocket, and just go up to a nice lady, kind of dig a.
That's right. Yeah.
Walk around.
Yeah.
That'll work, right, Brittany?
No.
Oh well. Yeah.
Okay. So I did want to ask though. You've mentioned a lot of bats. Do you have a favorite bat?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think probably one of my favorite bats, if we're speaking worldwide, is the scientific name is Vampirum spectrum. One of its common names is the spectral vampire bat.
Sounds cool.
It just has such a badass name.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean both the common name and the scientific name are just super cool. It's also called the spectral bat, and it's I believe the largest bat in the New World tropics, and it actually eats other bats and also other small mammals, and I think sometimes birds as well. And I've heard accounts from chiropterologists down in South America where they'll actually catch one of these bats in a mist net, and then they'll walk up to it and find it eating other bats out of the net, which I think is just awesome. Yeah. Now, as far as North America and my study area is concerned, I really like the eastern small-footed bat. It's our smallest bat here in North America. It's about the size of like half your thumb.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's tiny. It's so adorable. It has a little black bandit mask on its face.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and they live on cliff faces and in boulder fields, and they are just so cute. They have a wonderful little feisty attitude, but it's also nice because their mouth is so small that it doesn't really hurt when they bite. So yeah, but yeah, that's probably my favorite one, here in the eastern U.S. So
We'll have to post a picture of it on our social media.
yes,
because it
yeah,
sounds
yeah, and post a picture of Vampirum spectrum. It
Absolutely.
is.
Definitely have to
It
do
is
that.
a little bit freaky looking, but it's really cool. Yeah.
So all these cute little bats that you get to collect and grab, and the tiny little foot bat where it tries to, bite you. It's so cute when
Yes.
it tries. Do you have any cool story about bat catching or any of your own personal experience that you'd want to share?
Yeah. Working on a military base is interesting. There was one night where I was out bat netting, and they decided to start shooting mortars pretty much over my head, pretty close to me. So that was a little interesting. I was bat netting in a war zone. Yeah. Another cool thing is you catch other random creatures of the night in your mist nets. I've caught owls before. I caught an eastern screech owl. I've caught a woodcock before, which is a really cool nocturnal bird. And probably one of the most interesting things I ever captured in my mist net was a bicyclist. Yeah, I was netting one night on a big wide open road, and I opened the net right at dusk and forgot to put up caution tape right away, an essential piece of bat netting gear. And before I knew it, bam! I had got a biker all hung up in my net. So yeah,
I bet he wasn't pleased.
yeah, he was a little pissed, to say the least. But he was okay. Yeah, and it all turned out okay. But yeah, that was not what I expected to catch that night.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Was
I was expecting little baddies, not a Homo sapien.
Big
So,
catch there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But the net's held.
All right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really cool. Do you have any other questions, Brittany?
I do not. I ran through all my
Okay.
questions.
That was awesome, Sam. So just as like a little recap,
Yes.
I thought it was really cool. So they're closer to primates rather than the flying, mouse.
Yep,
okay?
that's right,
Very
yeah.
diverse.
Yeah.
About you said a fourth.
Yeah,
of
roughly a quarter of all mammal species on the planet
extremely
are
diverse.
bats.
Really cool group. That's amazing. And of course, being so amazing, it only helps that they allow us to have delicious tequila.
Absolutely. Yes. If you take anything home from this, just the next time you have a glass of tequila, just raise your glass to the bats.
To the bat. I mean, one other thing I would love them to take home is the conservation of bats and thinking about putting up a nice bat house.
Yes. Please consider putting up a bat house. Bat Conservation International is probably, their website is probably the #1 resource for how to build a bat house. It's important to build it properly and place it properly. And you can find all that information on their website.
Okay. And then the other thing I'm going to take away is if we had to bet on a bat, I would choose the big brown bat so it can crush the skulls of its enemies
That's right.
with its mouth. All right. That will be where my money is. And then spiky penis. Wonderful spiky
yes.
penis in-flight entertainment.
Yes. And don't forget the wonderful perfume.
The wonderful perfume.
Yes.
Great.
Yep.
Well, Sam, this has been marvelous. Soon to be Dr. Freeze. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I'm very thankful for you guys having me here. I love talking about bats.
Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Not that we can answer your bat questions, but you can always contact us, though.
Yeah, you can contact us. So you can contact us on Gmail under prtcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under prtcast.
And you send me all those pictures. How do you take those pictures of the bats you catch?
Yeah, well,
I figured.
Yes, my wonderful wife who's sitting here next to me. She is an excellent conservation photographer and also a very accomplished wildlife biologist in her own right. So she tags along with me. It's a lot of fun, and she takes all the cool pictures.
That sounds really amazing. So I was going to ask, would it be possible to get a couple of pictures to share with our listeners?
Absolutely.
That would be awesome. We can, talk about some of the bat stuff, and they can see cute little things.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Cute little bats.
Awesome. Wonderful. Is there anything else, Brittany?
You can also help us out by donating to our Patreon. So our Patreon is also at PRTcast, and this way we can help, find more people to talk about different things, not just bats, but lots of other topics as well. So consider donating, please.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you, Sam. Wonderful, lovely
Absolutely.
wife. Really appreciate you guys coming here. Great, and we'll be back next week.
We will be back next week. Thanks.